Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra, Editor-in-Chief of People's Dispatch, and as always, I'm very excited to be joined by Roger McKenzie, International Editor of Morning Star News, and Prasanth, an Indian journalist. Today's an important day. It's a very big anniversary, 80 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into a lot more. The genocide in Gaza rages on. Minimal but important steps are being taken. So we're going to get into all of that in a minute.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
So, Roger, again, today is the 80th anniversary of a pretty notable and historic event, the day the world stood still in a lot of ways. Can you tell us a little bit about what this 80th anniversary means? What is the legacy today?
Well, firstly, the 6th of August also shares a much better anniversary, which is the Independence Day for Jamaica. So everybody, congratulations for independence in Jamaica. But it also shares this day of infamy, where the US became the first and still only nation to drop an atomic bomb. They don't seem to have learned from this at all. And when we look at a measure of how close we are to another nuclear catastrophe, there's few better than a load of scientists who were involved in the Manhattan Project in the first place, who produced this bulletin every year that talks about how close we are to another nuclear catastrophe. They call it the doomsday clock. And when they looked at this earlier on during the year, we were 89 seconds to midnight, which means that we are 89 seconds in their calculations to another nuclear catastrophe. Of course, the world's got more dangerous since then. So we're probably even closer now. Just last week, we saw President Trump decide to station a load of nuclear submarines near Russia because he'd had an online row with somebody who used to be the president of Russia. How pathetic is this? This isn't some game. This is about a real life. This is a real issue, and Trump seems to think that putting us closer to danger is the way to go. But what he also is doing is reflecting this kind of notion that it's possible to win a nuclear conflict. And the US have made no bones about this at all, that they really believe that they can win a nuclear war. And, it's a question of who's going to be the last remnants of a nation that's left standing, but they think they can do that. And there's been all sorts of talk in recent months about how we can use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield and so on. I should say at the outset, really, that I've got one of the roles I have is as vice president of the biggest peace movement in Britain, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and we say all the time that there really must be a reduction, much more done to make sure that we don't step even nearer this kind of catastrophe. But in Britain, what we're seeing is we're seeing at Lakenhall in Norfolk, the US has put bombers back in Britain again for the first time in many, many years. They haven't admitted it straight out because they don't, but this is something that they've done again. We are so close to another nuclear catastrophe, and people are not listening to the points that are being made year in, year out for the last 80 years by people who were the victims of that first nuclear bomb in Hiroshima. And they give us the information every year. They tell us how dangerous it is. They tell us that it's not just about the impact on the people when the bomb is first dropped, but the years and years of devastation that is caused by that bomb, and people are not listening to that. Politicians are not listening, and we've got to really amplify those voices. And what you will not hear in the rest of the mainstream media is the sort of things that we talk about on independent progressive media, because they seem to think it is some moral kind of issue that, oh, poor things in Japan and so on, when actually the key thing here is we need to stop this proliferation of nuclear weapons. We need to remove nuclear weapons out of the equation, and we need to make sure that people understand the impact of nuclear weapons and how close we are at this moment in time for a repeat.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. Even just a couple months back, as we covered on this show and on People's Dispatch, how close we were to a confrontation between India and Pakistan, two of the nuclear armed countries, and what a disaster that, of course, would have been. Yeah, so it's important to continue to follow these commemorations because, as you say, Roger, it's not just a moral question. It is really about the survival of humanity. And this shift in the military doctrine, in the nuclear doctrine of the United States, is extremely worrying. And especially when you have someone like Donald Trump at the head, you can only really fear for this. And it's interesting, as we saw those images on the screen of, Japan, of Nagasaki, of Hiroshima after these bombs were dropped, the images look really similar to what we're seeing in Gaza today. 22 months of sustained bombing, of course, not using nuclear weapons, but sustained bombing of every single part of the territory, targeting of civilians. Prasanth, we've covered this a lot. There's been hope, there's been setbacks. Can you give us the latest of the situation in Gaza right now?
Right. I mean, I think there are quite a few aspects to cover. And the most important one, of course, is the continuing crisis of famine that is really gripped the territory right now due to the Israeli blockade. And I think with day after day, I think Roger will talk more about this from the perspective of the media, but day after day, you see more and more reports coming, which really bring clarity to the ground in terms of numbers and statistics. Although for those who wanted to see what is happening, it was very clear for many, many months now that we were going to see a famine, to a famine of this extent. And in fact, the first signs of famine were declared even last year in some parts of Gaza, and now it has become a generalized crisis. So if you look at the numbers, for instance, I think about 193 people have died out of famine and malnutrition since the war started in October 2023. But I believe only before, say, in the past 1.5 months, maybe 90% of the casualties took place the past 1.5 months, because I think up to July or so, the numbers were about 18 or so. And by July, the numbers were 18, and now it's about 193. And of these, again, say about 90 or 95 people, and of those who died are children, which really shows, because children are the worst affected at this point. The accounts on the ground are really heartrending. People struggling to even, spending hours walking in search of a morsel of food. People struggling to explain to their children how, how they're going to survive. The sheer, the stories are excruciating. They're horrible, and it's most important because this is an entirely preventable famine, and it's a deliberately engineered famine. Again, something which UN experts, journalists on the ground, everyone has been pointing out. We know that there are thousands of trucks waiting outside the boundaries or borders of Gaza right now. Israel has not allowed any aid inside. What is being allowed is, say, less than 100 trucks of aid a day, whereas the actual requirement is around 600 truckloads or so. So only maybe 1/6 of what is necessary is being allowed inside. The way of distribution is equally horrible. We know that there were about 400 points of distribution until some months ago. All of those have been scrapped. Now the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has basically 4 points, which have turned out to be complete death traps. Every day you hear of 10, 15, 20, 30, 35 people being shot as they try to access food. The worst part is people know that this, going to get food is of is lethal, is going to probably get them killed, but they still have no other option. Again, you read the reports, you hear people saying that, we had decided that we are not going to go there, or parents fooling or telling their children that, oh, I'm not going there, and then are going there nonetheless to get some food, but then ending up getting shot or killed. So really, really horrible stories. And in the midst of all this, you have the Israeli cabinet now deliberating whether they should just occupy the whole of Gaza, right? So at this point, there's a huge debate going on. Like I said, Roger's going to talk more about this, but like we've talked about many times in the past, genocide clearly being live streamed over here. The global in the inability of the international community to act at this point is perhaps one of the most disgraceful episodes in humanity's recent history. There's no question about it, because rarely has there been such clear evidence of a barbaric, brutal genocidal action and a complete unwillingness and paralysis in terms when confronted with it.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing some of the mass outrage to this truly horrific moment. This past weekend, of course, a historic mobilization that took place in Sydney, Australia. There's more protests that are planned in cities across the world because this level of depravity of this, horrific treatment of the Palestinian people, of civilians, is reaching a new sector of society. And I think people feel outraged that there is no true insignificant and decisive international action. Things which just a year and a half ago seemed, impossible have now become normalized. The bombing of hospitals, the abduction of healthcare workers, the fact, which Roger is going to get to in a moment, the fact that no foreign journalists are allowed on the ground. Not to say that the heroic Palestinian journalists in Gaza are not doing a fantastic job, but of course, there is an element of needing kind of this outside perspective, people to be able to hear it from people they know. This is crucial, and the fact that no foreign journalists have been able to access the Gaza Strip for the past 22 months, except for people who are embedded with the IDF. Of course, we saw Steve Witkoff do a kind of farcical visit, completely documented by the U.S. Government's media department. This is not really showing the truth and the facts on the ground. Roger, tell us a little bit about this kind of media restriction and the new voices coming out for access.
Well, I think one of the first things to say initially is to repeat the point that you made, Zoe, about the heroic nature of the journalists who are still on the ground and providing us with the sort of images that we are seeing, that has made the case for why action must be taken to stop this starvation and to expose the behavior of the IDF. And the way that the US and the British are absolutely complicit in all of this. We have one of the reasons what I think is happening right now is I think there's been a real change because of the protests that have been taking place across the globe that has shifted public opinion, and it's shifted the attitude, I think, of lots of politicians across the globe as well. And that's why I think we're seeing more of a shift in terms of more countries saying now that they will recognize the Palestinian state and so on. But what we've also seen in recent times is more of these international news outlets raising their voices and saying that it is time for more outside journalists to be allowed into Gaza. Should be said as well, of course, that there's a number of these major news outlets, such as the BBC, that have complied with the restrictions that have been placed on them by the Israelis. And just over the last week or so, we saw when the very limited aid drops that are being allowed into Gaza started to happen. We saw planes going over. We saw journalists on those planes, and we saw those journalists being barred from reporting what they saw, being barred from taking pictures, from being barred from showing with their cameras, and again, because what you said before, because of the absolute devastation that's been caused, and there's no way the Israelis want that to be shown. What we saw a couple of days ago We saw something like 200 major news outlets, 200 of the most senior, I suppose, war correspondents, international correspondents from across the globe, from organizations such as the BBC, such as CNN, such as Sky News, and a whole range of others, and really notable people coming out again, because they've done it before. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them have said before that it's time that journalists were allowed on the ground into Gaza. There's some difficulties with the statement that they made by saying things like, this is not a political statement, this is a thing about press freedom. Well, frankly, that is pretty political in my sense, particularly when I know more than 200 plus journalists have been killed. Most of those Palestinians, and of course, most of the journalists, news workers who are providing the information that we're seeing who have been killed are Palestinian journalists going about doing their jobs. But more journalists have been killed in Gaza, and I've made a note of it, killed in Gaza than in the US Civil War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, Vietnam, Yugoslav War, Afghanistan, Ukraine combined, right? That's what we're seeing. So we know why the Israelis are stopping this information from coming through, and they're doing it because they don't want the truth to be told about what they're doing to the people, the Palestinian people in Gaza. So absolutely welcome this statement from these journalists, and I hope that they follow it up. But to be really clear, there is no way on earth that these really senior journalists would be making even these comments without the permission of their news outlets. They simply wouldn't be doing that. And I think that wouldn't be happening without the protests, without the demonstrations that have been taking place across the world. There is a definite shift taking place at the moment, and that's because people have been demonstrating about it, and we need to keep up the pressure on them to make sure that there is access, but most of all, that the devastation that's being caused on the ground, the starvation that's being caused by the Israelis, is brought to a halt, and that there's an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
And in a lot of ways, these media outlets are kind of being left behind, because on social media, on different sorts of accounts, people are actually telling the stories that millions and billions of people across the world want to hear, which is what is happening on the ground in Gaza. And these media outlets kind of are realizing that they're also being left behind by not actually having real and accurate reporting on this. So that's another interesting element. Well, just to bounce back in a different, primary element of this day, which has been shaping, our life and the news for the past, 6 months, is it, since Trump has been sworn in? And this has been the question of tariffs. And really, I should say it's been part of the news since even before he was elected. This is a major campaign promise of him, which is why he's probably, taking it so seriously. Tariffs are not just an economic, element. It's not just about the taxes that are charged on products that are imported. They've taken on really a new nature. So Prasanth, this August 1st deadline has passed. Negotiations are kind of over with most of the countries. Tell us what's happening with Trump's tariffs. What's really behind them?
Yeah, right now India is kind of ground zero for that, because just as we were talking a few minutes ago, I saw the news that Trump has imposed another 25% of tariffs on India. And if the reports are accurate, that would mean the overall tariff rate is at 50%, which makes it, I think the biggest, the highest tariffs in Asia or something like that. I don't know if it actually beats the tariffs on China right now, but it's definitely quite close. Quite a major move right now. And I'll come to some of the context behind it. Equally interestingly, today, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's, it's been announced that he's going to visit China for the SCO meeting. There was a lot of speculation as to whether that would happen. Now, I'll talk about what's happening in some of the other parts of the world as well, but I'll start with India, because Trump's petulance over the past 1 week or 10 days has actually stemmed from his argument that India has been buying oil from Russia, and that is also the stated reason for his additional 25% tariffs that he's imposed today. Now, this is a very curious situation right now because when the special military operation in Russia's attack began, what the European Union, the Americans together, basically they declared a cap on Russian oil, and they were very happy for India to buy oil in that reduced price cap, because then India bought that oil, and then some of that oil was processed and sold back to other parts of the world, including Europe. So that actually kept the prices low, and according to the Europeans and the United States, that prevented Russia from making a lot of profit. So that was part of the European and US strategy, allowing, so to speak, India to buy more of that oil. And India also made it very clear that it wanted to do so because it actually allowed inflation to stay in check. It was able to buy oil at very cheap rates, and it was able to escape from the disruption caused by the disruption that would have occurred if supplies had come down, because India depends a lot on imported oil. But right now, what Trump is doing is now he's suddenly weaponized these imports, and the hypocrisy is incredible because the Europeans have been buying a lot of stuff from Russia indirectly. The United States, until very recently, Trump was very happy to engage with Putin as well. So something has happened over the past 1 month or so. I think that story is yet entirely to be told, because he suddenly started talking about 50-day ceasefire, 50 days end the war in Ukraine, 12 days end the war in Ukraine, etc. And now India seems to have been caught in the crossfire. This is a very interesting moment globally, because I think how India chooses to respond to this is going to be very important, I think, for all of us. A similar moment took place immediately after the events in Ukraine in 2022. There was a lot of pressure on India to condemn Russia, to sort of turn its back on Russia, an old ally, of course. Russia has been to India. But India very smartly and strategically took the stance it would not do so. And it ended up being one of the leaders, one of the key players in the global south, which did not take that stance. And if you look at the overall picture, you will find that most of the countries in the global south did not take a harsh position against Russia at that point of time. Now, India has lost a lot of that moral authority in the time since, especially because of its vacillating stance on Gaza. But right now, once again, there is a political, there is an economic, there is a diplomatic reason for India to once again reassert its sovereignty at this point and tell the United States that enough is enough, and we can't be bullied like this. And it's a very important opportunity for India to actually show the way, let's say, to our countries in the global south, because this is like you said, tariffs are, it's a global challenge. Now, there's one part of the tariffs equation, which is that actually it's quite likely that a lot of the effects will be felt on customers in the US. There's no question about that, because those high prices are going to be transferred onto the customers. At the same time, there are also examples like, for instance, Lesotho. Like you saw, Lesotho was, in Africa, was a small country, was hit with 50% tariffs in April. Trump revised it down, and now they have 15%. But the fact that there was that 50% announcement led to a huge collapse of its textile sector, which used to export a lot to the United States. And now you have stories of factories being shut, of people having to go home. The entire economy is in crisis just because of that announcement and the fact that it lasted 1 week and the uncertainty that it has stemmed. Now you go to South Africa, which is facing 30% tariffs because Trump has somehow bought into this completely absurd white genocide theory. And you see that South African authorities saying that 30,000 jobs could be under threat. Could be under threat in South Africa. You see Brazil is facing tariffs about 50%. Although Lula has played it quite smart, he's been defined in the exact right kind of way. And I think it's actually a larger question for countries in the global south, including China, including India, including South Africa, Russia, Brazil, many other countries, so many Africa, that does this become an opportunity to actually come up with a collective strategy to diversify your economy? See, no one is saying that you go all out and defy Trump and invite more, because that's probably going to lead to more pain for your people. That's really not the point. The point is not just to sort of challenge Trump openly and get that feel-good moment for about 2 weeks or a small bump in the polls. The only structural solution to this is if you're able to kind of diversify economies, forge stronger links with countries in the global south, That's what China did when in 2017, I mean, during the first Trump regime, they kind of realized that they needed to diversify their exports. They couldn't be so dependent on the US as a market. And they were able to do it to the extent that they are somehow able to kind of defy, say, 8 or 10 years, they were able to do that, right? So this is a long-term issue. Just because Trump might go in a couple of years, but that does not solve this problem. The United States is going to stick to some form of protectionism in the coming time as well. So it's a huge opportunity and a big challenge for countries in the global south. Can they stick together, find ways to sort of intensify their cooperation and create a different model? Can they create institutions? Can they create forums? Can they create trade mechanisms? All of which kind of reduce the harm that the United States can do to each of these countries right now. Because I think what this shows is that it's not just the nuclear bombs, it's not just the sanctions, but there are so many weapons in the US arsenal, all of which can lead to loss of livelihoods, hunger. So there are so many threats right now. So it's a big challenge, very interesting moment, and like I said, an opportunity for countries across the global south.
Well, it's a really important story, Prasanth, and I think what you said at the last moment is really poignant, because it is true that there's some countries that maybe said, okay, we'll play ball politically, we're going to align with the US interests, we're going to represent their political position. And even that wasn't enough to save them, because we saw a lot of US allies that have been hit with really high tariffs because of their own economic policies. We saw that kind of across Latin America, interesting examples of that. So again, this is another tool, and it is clear that even if you align politically with the United States, it does not mean that you're going to be saved from their ability to use unilateral measures. And as you mentioned, Brazil is a really interesting example of that. Lula da Silva began his term January 1st, 2023. His government has been one of coalition. And so a lot of people from the left were thinking, okay, finally, we're going to reverse all of that Bolsonaro policy to, cozy up to the United States. And in a lot of ways, Lula did challenge that. He rejoined CELAC. He became, really, once again, a leading figure in BRICS. But that didn't mean that he was going to, throw the United States out to dry. But still, in the last month, we've seen, in the last couple of months, we've seen a very clear example of this, that even though Lula did not take this confrontational stance with the United States, on one hand, Brazil's economic policies, and then on the other hand, the political and close personal relationships that Trump and members of his family have with the family of Jair Bolsonaro actually weighed out way more importantly. And we saw that, in the last couple of weeks, Trump had sent this letter saying that the United States was going to impose 50% tariffs unless the persecution, in quotes, of Jair Bolsonaro ended. And I think that was the moment where Lula said, exactly as you said, Prasanth, that he really calibrated this defiant stance. And he said, okay, we haven't been confrontational, but once you say that you're going to use a unilateral economic policy to try to change the decisions of our sovereign judiciary, that is when it's been a stone too far. And since that letter was sent, on one hand, the judicial process with Jair Bolsonaro has continued. This week, Alexandra Moraes, who's the Supreme Court Justice, ordered house arrest for Jair Bolsonaro because he was violating different elements of what were the conditions for him to be a part of this process. He had been using social media to promote his case. There had been different mobilizations. He had done video calls with, his political allies, who then spoke in the mobilizations and said, Jair Bolsonaro says this. So really violating all elements of these conditions of his, in his legal process. And on the other hand, Lula, on the economic front, has insisted that, he's not going to cave to Trump's demands, and that, of course, negotiations are the only way to deal with this. Still, the tariff of 50% stands, but in all public spaces and interviews, in the PT national meeting that took place this past week, Lula has said very firmly, we are open to negotiation, we will not be bullied, and that we also have other options. So Trump needs to come to the table and negotiate. We're not going to change our process with Jair Bolsonaro, who, of course, supported a coup, called his supporters to participate in the coup. You can't change those facts. And so he said, whatever happens, they're going to continue, but they want negotiations. So house arrest ordered for Jair Bolsonaro this week is a huge, huge historic moment and milestone, given the number of crimes and that he's accused of, that he committed. So it's a turning point in Brazil. Lula taking this firm stance, saying we will not allow you to meddle within our sovereignty. And we've seen that it's actually had mass appeal, and people are supporting Lula. His ratings are higher than ever, his approval rating. So I think it's really showing that in this game of using tariffs to impose political measures, standing up to Trump is actually in the measured way again is paying off. And so we'll see again, this August 1st deadline has passed. How are these countries going to proceed? Are they going to diversify, as you said, Prasanth? Are they going to engage in these multilateral global South institutions? How will these be strengthened to actually live up to the needs of the moment? Because I think that's a key question. There's, of course, more BRICS meetings that are coming up. BRICS Social Council, the people are hungry for these kind of alternative mechanisms. And Trump, in his accelerationist way, has kind of forced the need to actually take these seriously. So, of course, we'll be following this. That brings us to the end of the show. Make sure you follow every week. Follow People's Dispatch. Follow Morningstar News. Make sure you're reading our articles, sharing them with your friends. Let us know what else do you want us to be covering? What else should we talk about on the show? Always open to suggestions, and we'll see you next week.